The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, and the room filled with a low hum of anticipation. Spectators leaned forward on the benches, eyes locked on the defendant sitting calmly at the defense table. Her name was Jordan Blake. Dark brown skin, high cheekbones, and sharp dark eyes framed by perfectly styled waves of black hair. She was wearing a fitted black suit, a silk blouse beneath it, and a pair of diamond studs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Her posture was relaxed, hands folded neatly on the table, but there was a quiet intensity beneath the surface. Across the aisle, Karen Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table. She was in her early 40s with platinum blonde hair in a rigid bob, wearing a beige designer suit. Her posture was tense, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the table. A thin smirk played at the corner of her mouth as she glanced toward Jordan. Karen leaned toward her lawyer, Philip Garner, a young, overeager attorney with slick back hair and a desperate need to prove himself. "She looks nervous," Karen whispered. Jordan's gaze remained steady, her expression giving nothing away. Judge Howard Grayson entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing behind him. He was a man in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a reputation for running a strict courtroom. He settled into his chair and glanced toward the bailiff. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood. Jordan's gaze remained cold and focused as Judge Grayson scanned the room. "You may be seated," the judge said. Judge Grayson's sharp blue eyes settled on Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are accusing the defendant of assault and harassment. How do you plead?" Karen straightened her spine. "Guilty, Your Honor." Jordan's brow lifted slightly. Judge Grayson's mouth tightened. "The defendant has not entered a plea yet." Karen's lips curled into a faint smile. "Oh, my mistake." Jordan's attorney, David Langston, stood beside her. He was tall and calm, with salt and pepper hair and a quiet strength in his expression. "Not guilty, Your Honor," David said smoothly. Karen's smile widened. "Of course." Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened. "Proceed with opening statements." Philip Garner stood and approached the jury box, adjusting his suit jacket with exaggerated confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a simple case. My client, Mrs. Whitmore, was assaulted and harassed by the defendant, Miss Blake, without provocation. The evidence will clearly show that Miss Blake acted aggressively, verbally threatened Mrs. Whitmore, and physically assaulted her." Jordan's eyes darkened slightly. Philip's smile widened. "Mrs. Whitmore is a respected member of this community. She's involved in charity work, supports local schools, and comes from one of the most prominent families in this town. What happened to her was unacceptable, and today we are asking for justice." Jordan's lips curled slightly. Philip stepped back confidently. "Thank you." David rose from his seat and approached the jury with a calm, measured step. His gaze was sharp and focused. "Ladies and gentlemen, not everything is as it seems." David's voice was smooth, but carried an edge beneath it. "My client, Miss Blake, is not guilty of these charges. What you'll hear today is not about an assault, but about power, about privilege, and about what happens when people believe that their social status places them above accountability." Karen's eyes narrowed. David smiled faintly. "We'll show you the facts. And when you hear the full story, you'll understand why these charges should never have been brought forward." Judge Grayson's gaze hardened. "Prosecution, call your first witness." Philip stood. The prosecution calls Mrs. Karen Whitmore to the stand. Karen stood gracefully, smoothing the front of her expensive suit as she walked toward the stand. She sat down, crossed her legs, and smiled faintly as she took the oath. Philip approached. "Mrs. Whitmore, could you please describe the events of the afternoon in question?" Karen's expression darkened. "I was walking through the Lexington shopping plaza. I had just finished a lunch meeting with the school board when Miss Blake approached me." Philip's brow lifted. "And how did Miss Blake approach you?" Karen's eyes widened slightly. "Aggressively. She blocked my path and demanded to know why I was looking at her. I told her to leave me alone, but she raised her voice and threatened me." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "And then what happened?" Philip pressed. Karen's mouth tightened. "I tried to walk away, but she grabbed my arm." Gasps spread through the gallery. David's gaze sharpened. Philip smiled. And how did you respond? Karen's voice softened. I told her to let go, but she pushed me. I fell to the ground. I was terrified. David's eyes narrowed dangerously. Philip's smile widened. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. No further questions. David stood. Your Honor, permission to cross-examine? Proceed, Judge Grayson said. David approached the stand slowly, his gaze hard. Mrs. Whitmore, you stated that Miss Blake approached you and threatened you? Yes. And this was in broad daylight, in the middle of a public shopping plaza? Yes. David's brow lifted. Were there witnesses? Karen's mouth twitched. No one who wanted to get involved. David's smile sharpened. Interesting. Karen's eyes narrowed. And you claim Miss Blake grabbed you? Yes. David's brow furrowed. Do you have any physical evidence of that? Bruising? Marks? Karen's gaze sharpened. It's not visible anymore. David's gaze darkened. Convenient. Karen's lips pressed together. David smiled faintly. No further questions. Karen stood and walked back toward the prosecution's table, her gaze flicking toward Jordan with quiet triumph. Jordan's expression didn't change. Karen leaned toward Philip. Easy win. David sat down beside Jordan. They think they've got you. Jordan's dark eyes gleamed coldly. Let them think that. The courtroom was charged with tension the following morning. The gallery was even more crowded than the day before, and reporters lined the back wall with notepads and cameras at the ready. The story had already started circulating. Wealthy socialite Karen Whitmore facing off against a mysterious black woman who had yet to say much of anything. Jordan Blake entered the courtroom with the same calm grace as the day before. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she took her seat at the defense table. She was dressed in a sleek black suit, her hair pulled back into a precise bun. The gold cufflinks at her wrists gleamed faintly under the lights. Across the room, Karen Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table. She wore a soft cream-colored blouse and a tailored skirt. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, her manicured nails resting delicately on the table. A subtle smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Philip Garner leaned toward her, his voice low. We've got this. Karen's smile widened faintly. Of course we do. Judge Howard Grayson entered the room, adjusting his glasses as he settled into his chair. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Mr. Garner, Judge Grayson said, you may proceed. Philip stood and buttoned his suit jacket with a smooth, practiced motion. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call its next witness, Mrs. Elizabeth Hargrove. David Langston leaned toward Jordan. Here we go. Jordan's gaze didn't waver. Let them talk. Elizabeth Hargrove, a middle-aged woman with neatly styled gray hair and a pearl necklace, approached the stand. She wore a conservative navy blue dress and clutched her handbag tightly in her lap as she sat down. The bailiff swore her in. Philip approached, his smile polished and professional. Mrs. Hargrove, could you please tell the court where you were on the afternoon of the incident? I was having coffee at the Lexington Shopping Plaza, Hargrove said, her voice steady. And did you witness the alleged confrontation between Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Blake? Yes, Hargrove replied. I saw the whole thing. Philip's smile widened. And what exactly did you see? Hargrove's gaze flicked toward Jordan. Miss Blake approached Mrs. Whitmore aggressively. She raised her voice, and when Mrs. Whitmore tried to walk away, Miss Blake grabbed her arm. Karen's smile widened, and then Philip prompted. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Whitmore asked her to let go. Miss Blake pushed her. She fell to the ground. David's brow lifted slightly. Philip smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Hargrove. No further questions. David stood. His movements were slow and deliberate as he approached the stand. His expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened as he met Hargrove's gaze. Mrs. Hargrove, David said smoothly, you testify that you saw the entire incident? Yes. And you were seated where? Hargrove's brow furrowed. At the outdoor patio. David's brow lifted. And the incident took place where? Hargrove hesitated. Near the fountain. David's gaze sharpened. How far is the patio from the fountain? Hargrove's mouth twitched. About 40 feet. David smiled faintly. 40 feet. Hargrove's expression tightened. David's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Hargrove, do you wear corrective lenses? Hargrove's mouth pressed into a thin line. Yes. And were you wearing them at the time? Hargrove hesitated. No. David's smile widened. So, you're telling the court that you saw a confrontation from 40 feet away without your glasses? Hargrove's jaw tightened. Karen's smile faltered. David stepped closer. Mrs. Hargrove, are you absolutely certain you saw Miss Blake grab Mrs. Whitmore's arm? Hargrove's mouth twisted. I think so. David's smile sharpened. You think so? Hargrove's gaze flicked toward Karen. David's voice was calm, but cutting. Or did you just repeat what Mrs. Whitmore told you? Hargrove's mouth opened, but no words came out. David's smile faded. No further questions. Karen's smile had disappeared completely. Philip stood, his smile tight. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Mr. Thomas Perry to the stand. A tall man in his early 50s approached the stand. He wore a gray suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. He took the oath and settled into the chair. Philip smiled. Mr. Perry, where were you on the day of the incident? I was walking toward the parking lot, Perry replied. And what did you see? I saw Miss Blake talking to Mrs. Whitmore. Then she raised her hand and shoved her. David's eyes narrowed. Philip smiled. Thank you, Mr. Perry. No further questions. David stood. He approached the stand with the same calm intensity as before. Mr. Perry, David began, you stated that you saw Miss Blake shove Mrs. Whitmore? Yes. And you were where? Near the parking lot. David's brow lifted. That's over 70 feet from the fountain, correct? Yes. David smiled faintly. Interesting. Did you hear what was being said? No. David's gaze sharpened. So you didn't actually hear Miss Blake threaten Mrs. Whitmore? No. David stepped closer. And you didn't see her physically touch Mrs. Whitmore? Perry's jaw tightened. I saw her raise her hand. David's smile widened. But you didn't see contact. Perry hesitated. No. David's gaze darkened. No further questions. As Perry stepped down from the stand, David leaned toward Jordan. They're unraveling. Jordan's eyes gleamed. They don't know how deep this goes yet. Karen's gaze sharpened as she turned toward Philip. Fix this, she hissed. Philip's face was pale. I'm trying. Judge Grayson's gavel struck the bench. We will adjourn until tomorrow morning. As Jordan stood, Karen's gaze followed her. You won't win. Jordan's smile was faint. I already have. The atmosphere in the courtroom the following morning was electric. Word had spread. The gallery was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and members of the local community. Everyone wanted to see how this was going to unfold. Karen Whitmore entered the courtroom with the same air of confidence as before, her manicured nails tapping lightly on the side of her designer handbag. She wore a pearl-white suit, her blonde bob-styled into soft waves. Philip Garner walked closely beside her, speaking to her in hushed tones. You're doing great, Philip said. Karen's smile was thin and sharp. I know. At the defense table, Jordan Blake sat calmly. Her dark eyes followed Karen with quiet intensity. Jordan wore a fitted navy blue suit, her hair styled into a sleek bun. The diamond studs in her ears glinted under the overhead lights. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet steel beneath her calm expression. David Langston leaned toward her. Ready. Jordan's dark eyes glinted. It's time. Judge Howard Grayson entered the courtroom, his black robe billowing behind him as he took his seat at the elevated bench. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Philip stood, adjusting his tie as he approached the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Mrs. Whitmore back to the stand for further testimony. Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened. Proceed. Karen stood gracefully, smoothing the front of her jacket as she walked toward the stand. She took the oath and settled into the chair, her smile widening slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Philip approached, his smile polished. Mrs. Whitmore, I know this has been difficult for you. Could you clarify for the court exactly what happened during your encounter with Miss Blake? Karen's expression darkened. Yes. She approached me outside the Lexington shopping plaza. She was aggressive from the start. When I asked her to step aside, she grabbed my arm and pushed me. David's gaze sharpened. Philip's smile widened. And you're certain of that? Absolutely. David rose from his seat. Your Honor, permission to cross-examine? Granted, Judge Grayson said. David approached the stand with slow, measured steps. His gaze was hard as steel. Mrs. Whitmore, David began, you stated that Miss Blake grabbed your arm? Yes. David's brow lifted. Did you have any injuries? Karen's expression faltered. It didn't leave a mark. David's gaze sharpened. Interesting. Did you seek medical attention? No. David's lips curled faintly. And you didn't think that was important? Karen's mouth tightened. David stepped closer. You also stated that Miss Blake pushed you. Did you fall? Karen hesitated. Yes. And there were no bruises or scrapes? No. David's smile widened. That's convenient. Karen's expression sharpened. What are you suggesting? David's gaze darkened. Zet you lit. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Philip stood. Objection. Overruled. Judge Grayson said coolly. David leaned closer. Mrs. Whitmore, the court has reviewed surveillance footage from the Lexington shopping plaza. Would you like to explain why that footage shows no physical contact between you and Miss Blake? Karen's eyes widened. What? David smiled coldly. Exhibit C, Your Honor. David walked toward the media console and inserted a flash drive. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The footage was clear. Karen was standing near the fountain, her posture tense. Jordan approached her calmly. They spoke for a moment. No sound, but Jordan's body language was composed. Karen stepped toward Jordan, not the other way around. Karen's mouth moved, and then she stumbled backward. Jordan's hands remained at her sides. Gasps spread through the gallery. David's smile sharpened. Would you like to explain that, Mrs. Whitmore? Karen's mouth opened and closed. That's not what happened. David's gaze darkened. The footage says otherwise. Karen's face flushed. David pressed the remote, advancing the video frame by frame. You see this moment? David's voice sharpened. This is the exact second when you claim that Miss Blake grabbed your arm. The footage showed Karen taking a step toward Jordan, her mouth twisted into an angry sneer. Jordan remained perfectly still. David's brow lifted. And this is where you claim Miss Blake shoved you. Karen's eyes widened as the video showed her suddenly stumbling back. David's gaze narrowed. What you failed to mention is that you lost your balance because of your heels. Karen's face burned red. David's tone sharpened. You lied under oath, Mrs. Whitmore. Karen's mouth opened. David's smile was razor sharp. No further questions. Karen sat frozen as the screen went dark. Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have anything to say? Karen's mouth twisted. David interrupted smoothly. Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce additional evidence. Judge Grayson's gaze darkened. Proceed. David pulled out a thin file and handed it to the bailiff. These are sworn statements from employees at the Lexington shopping plaza, including 2 security guards and a store clerk, all of whom witnessed the incident and confirmed that Miss Blake never touched Mrs. Whitmore. Karen's face drained of color. David's smile sharpened. It seems Mrs. Whitmore fabricated the entire encounter. Philip stood. Objection. Overruled. Judge Grayson said coldly. David's gaze darkened. And we have one more piece of evidence, Your Honor. David pulled out a small leather wallet from his pocket. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge. David's voice was calm and cutting. Miss Blake isn't just a private citizen. She's the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A stunned silence filled the room. Karen's mouth parted in shock. David smiled thinly. Did you know that, Mrs. Whitmore? Karen's eyes were wide. Jordan stood slowly. Her gaze was cold as steel. I was there because I was conducting an investigation into corrupt business practices linked to Mrs. Whitmore's family foundation, Jordan said calmly. Gasps swept through the room. David's smile was razor sharp. Miss Blake was acting in her capacity as a federal officer. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Judge Grayson's gaze darkened. Mrs. Whitmore, sit down. Karen sank in her chair, her face pale. Jordan's dark eyes gleamed. David leaned toward her. That was brutal. Jordan's smile widened faintly. We're not finished yet. The courtroom was suffocating with silence. Karen Whitmore sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her hands clutching the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. Her usually composed expression had crumbled into one of disbelief and quiet panic. Jordan Blake stood calmly at the defense table, her posture steady and composed. The gold FBI badge clipped to her blazer gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights. Her dark eyes, sharp and calculating, remained fixed on Karen. David Langston leaned toward Jordan, his mouth curling into a satisfied smile. She's unraveling. Jordan's gaze didn't waver. Let her. Judge Howard Grayson's gaze sharpened as he adjusted his glasses. His eyes swept toward Karen. Mrs. Whitmore, his voice was cold and sharp. You've been accused of fabricating this entire incident. Do you have a response? Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Philip Garner stood, his face tight with barely concealed desperation. Your Honor, my client is under immense stress. She's been unfairly attacked. Sit down, Mr. Garner. Judge Grayson's tone was cutting. Philip's mouth twisted, but he slowly sat back down. David rose from his seat. His movements were smooth and deliberate as he approached the media console at the front of the room. Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce further evidence to support the claim that Mrs. Whitmore deliberately fabricated this incident. Karen's eyes widened. What? David's smile widened. Exhibit D. David inserted a flash drive into the console. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The footage showed Karen Whitmore sitting in a dimly lit lounge, a cocktail in hand. She was speaking to a man, middle-aged, wearing a tailored suit. Karen, laughing, she doesn't know who she's messing with. The man's face wasn't visible, but his voice was clear. Man, and what if she pushes back? Karen smiled faintly. Then we ruin her. Gasps spread through the gallery. Karen's face paled. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed. Who is that man? David's gaze sharpened. That is Paul Whitmore, Karen Whitmore's husband. Karen's mouth opened. That's... David's smile was cold. Oh, there's more. David advanced the footage. Paul, laughing. And if she makes trouble? Karen leaned toward him, her voice sharp. We own this town, Paul. No one's going to believe a black woman over me. A stunned silence swept through the room. David's smile sharpened. Mrs. Whitmore, care to explain that? Karen's face burned red. That's taken out of context. David's brow lifted. Is it? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Judge Grayson's voice was ice cold. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have anything to say? Karen's gaze darted toward Philip. Philip stood, his face pale. Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Garner. Judge Grayson's voice cut through the room. Philip's mouth twisted, but he sat. Karen's expression hardened. You can't seriously believe. David cut her off. We're not finished. David walked toward the defense table and pulled out another file. He handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed as he opened the file. David's voice sharpened. These are financial records. Bank transfers from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Each transfer is linked to the Whitmore Foundation, and each deposit corresponds with campaign donations to Judge Alan Whitmore's re-election fund. Karen's face twisted. That's a lot. David's smile was cold. We traced the transfers. The account belongs to your husband. Judge Grayson's gaze darkened. Mrs. Whitmore, are you suggesting that the evidence presented is false? Karen's mouth tightened. This is a setup. David's gaze sharpened. Or maybe you assumed that your influence would protect you. Karen shot to her feet. You think you can humiliate me? Jordan's dark eyes gleamed coldly. No, Karen. You did that to yourself. Karen's face twisted with rage. This is ridiculous. David smiled faintly. Oh, it's very real. Karen pointed toward Jordan. She's manipulating all of you. Judge Grayson's gaze hardened. Mrs. Whitmore. Karen's chest rose and fell sharply. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. I own this town. Jordan's gaze didn't waver. Not anymore. Judge Grayson's gavel slammed down. Enough. Karen's mouth twisted. You can't. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Whitmore, you are hereby charged with perjury, obstruction of justice, and filing a false police report. You are also under investigation for financial crimes linked to your husband's offshore accounts. Karen's face twisted with rage. You think you can do this to me? David's smile widened. We already did. The bailiff approached. Mrs. Whitmore, please stand. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The bailiff took her arm. Karen twisted violently. You can't do this. I'll ruin you. Jordan's gaze darkened. You already ruined yourself. Karen's eyes burned with hatred. You think this is over? Jordan smiled faintly. Oh, it's just getting started. Karen's scream echoed through the courtroom as the bailiff led her toward the exit. Jordan sat down slowly. David leaned toward her. Well played. Jordan's dark eyes gleamed coldly. We're not finished. David's brow lifted. What's next? Jordan's smile was thin. Paul Whitmore. David's smile widened. We're going after the husband? Jordan's eyes flashed. Always follow the money. 1 week later, the front page of the New York Times read, Wealthy socialite Karen Whitmore arrested on perjury and fraud charges. Husband under federal investigation. Below the headline was a photo of Karen Whitmore being escorted out of the courthouse, her hands in cuffs. Jordan sat in her Washington, D.C. office, overlooking the city skyline. Marcus Keene stood beside her, his arms crossed. Marcus's brow lifted. Karen's facing federal charges. Her husband's next. Jordan's smile widened faintly. Good. Marcus's mouth curled into a smile. How far are you going to take this? Jordan's dark eyes gleamed. All the way. Karen Whitmore's scream still echoed in the air long after the heavy courtroom doors had slammed shut behind her. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Jordan Blake sat calmly at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood surface. Her gold FBI badge gleamed on her blazer, no longer a secret but a statement of authority. Her dark eyes remained steady and sharp, watching as the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence. David Langston leaned toward her, his expression one of quiet amusement. That was satisfying. Jordan's lips curled faintly. Not yet. Judge Howard Grayson removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. His face was tight, his expression carefully neutral, but the tension in his eyes was unmistakable. Mr. Langston, Judge Grayson said, his voice low and sharp, it appears the facts presented by the defense have significantly altered the nature of these proceedings. David stood. Yes, Your Honor. The defense formally requests that all charges against my client, Director Blake, be dismissed with prejudice. Judge Grayson's gaze sharpened. On what grounds? David's smile was thin. On the grounds that the plaintiff, Mrs. Whitmore, perjured herself, fabricated evidence, and knowingly attempted to obstruct justice. And, Your Honor, let's not forget that my client was falsely accused while acting in her capacity as a federal officer. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Judge Grayson's mouth tightened. He glanced toward the empty plaintiff's table where Karen had sat only moments ago. Agreed. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Grayson's gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack. All charges against Miss Blake are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Jordan's expression didn't change, but a quiet satisfaction flickered in her dark eyes. And furthermore, Judge Grayson continued, the court is formally recommending that the Department of Justice launch a full investigation into the financial and legal practices of the Whitmore Foundation and all related accounts. Philip Garner shot to his feet. Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Garner. Judge Grayson's voice was cold and hard. Philip's mouth twisted, but he sat. His face was pale. Judge Grayson's gaze settled on David. Mr. Langston, your client is free to go. David's smile widened. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Grayson's gavel struck the bench one final time. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters surged toward Jordan. Microphones thrust toward her face as cameras flashed wildly. Director Blake. Jordan, how long have you known about Karen Whitmore's connection to the offshore accounts? David leaned toward Jordan. You don't have to answer. Jordan smiled faintly. Yes, I do. She stepped toward the reporters, her gaze steady and calm. The cameras zoomed in on her face. I have been investigating the Whitmore Foundation's financial ties to international money laundering for over a year, Jordan said calmly. Karen Whitmore's perjury today was not just about protecting her reputation. It was about protecting her family's criminal empire. Gasps spread through the room. And now, Jordan continued, the Department of Justice will ensure that the Whitmore Foundation faces full accountability, not just for today's events, but for the years of financial crimes that have gone unchecked. A reporter pushed forward. Director Blake, is Paul Whitmore also under investigation? Jordan's dark eyes glinted. Yes. And do you expect criminal charges? Jordan's smile was thin. Absolutely. Karen's lawyer, Philip Garner, stormed toward them, his face red. This is outrageous. You had no right to. Jordan's gaze sharpened. Careful, Mr. Garner. Philip's mouth twisted. My client is innocent. Jordan's brow lifted. Your client is currently in federal custody, facing charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. Philip's face paled. Jordan's smile widened faintly. You might want to reconsider your defense strategy. Philip's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He turned and stalked toward the exit, his face twisted in frustration. David chuckled. That was cold. Jordan's smile sharpened. Accurate. Marcus Keene stepped toward them, a black folder in his hand. Director Blake. Jordan's gaze sharpened. Report. Keene handed her the folder. Paul Whitmore's financial records. Offshore accounts, shell companies, wire transfers to known cartel associates. It's worse than we thought. David whistled under his breath. How bad? Keene's expression darkened. There are direct ties to several sitting state senators. Paul Whitmore was using the foundation to launder money and funneling campaign donations through it. Jordan's smile was faint. How long have they known? Years, Keene said. But now we have the proof. David's gaze sharpened. So what's the next move? Jordan's eyes glinted coldly. We follow the money. Keene smiled faintly. We're already tracing the transfers. The DOJ is preparing federal indictments. Jordan nodded. Good. David leaned toward her. You just tore down the Whitmore empire. That's going to make you a target. Jordan's dark gaze didn't waver. I've been a target my entire career. David smiled faintly. And if they try to stop you? Jordan's smile widened slightly. Then they'll regret it. Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. It's the Attorney General's office. Jordan nodded. I'll take in the car. Marcus stepped toward the black SUV parked at the curb. He opened the back door as Jordan approached. David leaned toward her. Drinks later? Jordan's smile was thin. Not yet. David chuckled. Of course not. Jordan slid into the SUV, her dark eyes glinting beneath the city lights as the door closed behind her. Marcus settled into the front passenger seat. So what's the plan? Jordan's voice was cool. We take down everyone involved. Marcus's brow lifted. Including the senators? Jordan's gaze sharpened. Especially the senators. The SUV pulled away from the courthouse and disappeared into traffic. David watched from the curb, his smile widening faintly. Now it gets interesting. 1 week later, the front page of the Washington Post read, Whitmore Empire collapses. Karen Whitmore and husband face federal charges. Beneath the headline was a photo of Karen and Paul Whitmore being led into a black federal vehicle, both in handcuffs. Jordan sat in her Washington, D.C. office, her gold badge resting on the desk beside her. Marcus Keene stood beside her. Keene's brow lifted. You did it. Jordan's smile was faint. Not yet. David stepped into the office. Charges are sticking. The Whitmores are finished. Jordan's gaze sharpened. Good. David leaned toward her. So, what happens next? Jordan's dark eyes flashed. We clean up the rest. David's smile widened. And if they push back? Jordan's smile sharpened. Then we push harder. 3 months later, the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, D.C. hummed with quiet efficiency. The sleek glass and steel structure stood like a fortress in the heart of the city. Inside, the air was cool and sharp, the sound of quiet footsteps and low conversation echoing through the hallways. Jordan Blake sat behind her large mahogany desk, overlooking the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her dark eyes were calm, her posture relaxed. A small stack of files sat neatly on the corner of her desk, next to her gleaming gold FBI badge. Marcus Keene stood across from her, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was sharp and focused. "They're finished," Keene said. Jordan's brow lifted slightly. "How finished?" Keene smiled faintly. "Karen and Paul Whitmore pled guilty to conspiracy, obstruction of justice, money laundering, and perjury." Jordan's dark eyes gleamed. "Sentencing?" Keene's smile widened. "Karen got 6 years. Paul got 10. Jordan's lips curled faintly. "Not bad." Keene chuckled. "And the Whitmore Foundation?" "Shut down," Jordan replied. "All assets seized. The DOJ is already reallocating the funds to community outreach programs." Keene's smile faded slightly. "And the senators?" Jordan's gaze sharpened. "Under investigation." David Langston entered the room, his dark suit crisp, his usual playful smile resting at the corners of his mouth. "They're already folding," David said. "2 of them have agreed to cooperate with the DOJ in exchange for reduced charges." Jordan's brow lifted. "And the others?" David's smile sharpened. "Not so lucky." Jordan leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "So, the Whitmore empire has officially collapsed." Keene smiled. "Completely." Jordan's eyes darkened. "Good." David stepped closer. "You know this is going to make you a target." Jordan's gaze didn't waver. "I've been a target my whole life." David's smile widened faintly. "And if they try to come after you?" Jordan's smile sharpened. "Then they'll regret it." Keene handed her a thin folder. Paul Whitmore's testimony. Jordan flipped it open, scanning the contents quickly. "He gave us names?" Keene nodded. "Direct ties to 2 sitting state senators, 1 federal judge, and a senior member of the governor's staff." David's brow lifted. "That's impressive." Jordan's eyes gleamed coldly. "They thought they were untouchable." David chuckled. "Not anymore." Jordan's gaze sharpened. "We go after the senators next." Keene's smile widened. "The DOJ already issued subpoenas." Jordan's dark eyes glinted dangerously. "Good." Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. "It's the Attorney General's office. They want an update." Jordan's brow lifted. "Tell them they'll get it when I'm finished." Keene's mouth curled into a smile. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus walked out of the office, leaving David and Jordan alone. David sat down across from her. His eyes were sharp, but his smile was relaxed. "So, now that you've taken down the most powerful family in Lexington, what's next?" Jordan's smile was thin. "We clean up the rest." David's gaze sharpened. "And if someone higher up tries to stop you?" Jordan's smile widened faintly. "They can try." David studied her for a moment. This was personal, wasn't it? Jordan's expression darkened. "Karen Whitmore thought she could destroy me because people like her think they're invincible. They think money and power make them untouchable." David's smile faded. "She learned the hard way." Jordan's gaze sharpened. "So will the others." David chuckled. "You sound dangerous." Jordan's eyes flashed. "I am." David's smile widened. "I know." Marcus re-entered the office, his expression serious. "We've got a problem." Jordan's gaze sharpened. "What kind of problem?" Keene handed her a tablet. "Anonymous wire transfers, large amounts, offshore accounts, all linked to a new entity." Jordan's brow furrowed. "How new?" Marcus's gaze darkened. 2 months. David's smile faded. "Someone's filling the vacuum." Jordan's expression hardened. "Who?" Keene's mouth tightened. "We don't know yet, but they're moving fast." Jordan's dark eyes gleamed coldly. "Then we move faster." David's brow lifted. "So you're not done yet?" Jordan smiled faintly. "It's never over." Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. "The Attorney General's office wants you to brief the task force." Jordan's gaze sharpened. "I'm not briefing anyone until I know who's behind this." David smiled faintly. "You know that means you'll be making enemies." Jordan's smile widened. "Good." Marcus's mouth curled into a smile. "We'll put together a task force." Jordan stood, straightening her blazer. "Make it tight. Keep it quiet." Marcus nodded. "Understood." David leaned toward her. "And what happens when you find out who's behind this?" Jordan's dark eyes glinted dangerously. "Then we bury them." David's smile widened. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Jordan's smile sharpened. "Stay out of my way, and you'll be fine." Marcus's phone buzzed again. They're waiting downstairs. Jordan nodded. Let's go. Marcus and David followed her out of the office. Jordan walked toward the elevator with quiet confidence, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. As the elevator doors closed, David leaned toward her. You know you're building a reputation, right? Jordan's smile was faint. Good. The elevator doors slid shut. Let them come. 3 weeks later, the front page of the Washington Post read, Whitmore Empire Collapses. FBI Director leads historic takedown of corruption network. Below the headline was a photo of Jordan Blake standing in front of the FBI headquarters, flanked by Marcus Keene and David Langston. Jordan sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the latest reports. Marcus and David stood nearby. Marcus smiled. Congratulations. Jordan's eyes sharpened. We're not finished yet. David chuckled. Of course not. Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. We've got a lead on the offshore transfers. Jordan's smile widened faintly. Let's get to work.